Hello! In this little video we are going to be looking at cloth journals as a little introduction. You may not have used them in your creativity before, but I want to introduce you to just a few varieties that I've got here in front of me and just run through the basics. It's not an instruction, this video, on how to actually create your journal. We're just going to look at it for inspiration, but there will be videos further down the line where you can actually use them as your instructions to create your own plain journal and then use it as your base to create your cloth journal. So here in front of me are a selection of journals, obviously, that I've already created, and I'm just going to introduce them because you can create them by hand, you can create them with the sewing machine on various ways. Slow stitching for me is about taking time out and actually just really focusing in on the fine details, and sometimes that is using a sewing machine. It's not always hand sewing. So I'm just going to run through a few ideas. Cloth journals are journals that you have created the pages, so you have created the outer cover, and then each page is created separately. Or it may be that you create a plain journal to start with and you add in little snippets as you work through your sort of ideas and inspirations. So this one, if I just pull to one side and we'll focus in a little bit. This one, the cover I've created using free motion embroidery, and it's a mixture of using paper with some vintage embroidery on glaze, and then I've just literally stitched over and added a little bit of applique in that equation using some vintage fabric and some embellishments. So if I just kind of bring that down here, I'm going to open the pages and you can sort of see some of the things that I put in my journals. They don't have to have a purpose. They can be literally just experimentation and exploration in creativity, or it may be that you create a cloth journal to use as almost as a reference library, and you can store all your pieces that you've practiced on. So you can add little pockets, you can make them into scrapbook journals and add postcards and memorabilia into them, memory journals, and I've got one here that we'll move on to in a moment. So this is me sort of experimenting with free motion embroidery really, and I've combined that with some vintage embroideries. And you can see how I've added them into the equation. I like to also put in quite a lot of old sort of haberdashery memorabilia and combine that with some new things. These are little samples of taken from a wedding dress sampler book that I've created, that I've added in here. And then you may want to add photographs into the equation. You might want to play with ideas. This is adding a little bit free motion embroidery around this sort of applique, but you could do that by hand. Here I've played with mixing cloth, thread, and then obviously using the colours of the buttons as inspiration. Now you will get, if you're anything like me and you've got these frayed edges, you will get these in your journals, and quite honestly I think that adds to the lovely textures. But if you don't like the edges frayed as I've done them here, you can obviously neaten yours and make them very neat. Again, another little pocket there. So that's my first little journal that I want to share with you. I'm going to bring in here also one that is in my Stitched Memories book. This is a memory journal of using haberdashery little treasures. Now I might need to sort of just scroll down. Okay, so I've used the same technique. I created each page and then worked on the page, and then at the end sewn the pages all together. And you can see I've added that here and left that quite organically, but you might want to cover your spine. And so I've used all sorts of found objects that I had from various members of the family that were left to me, or little buttons that I had in my sort of treasures. And I'm just going to open. You can see here, these are, so this was the front cover, and I've deliberately left this so that I can actually pull it apart and showcase. So this is why it's unfinished. So this is two pieces of fabric sewn together. They're just pinned together here, but this is how the next page has been created. So I've created this page separately and then gone around all the edge with a running stitch and hand sewn that down, but you could machine sew. So this is a vintage dressmaking pattern used for really storing things. Okay, so you can pop things in there. Obviously you've got vintage doilies. I've made a little pin cushion here out of an old little English paper pieced hexagon and pop that in there. This one here showcases my lovely Auntie Betty. This is almost like a little treasure of the sort of things that Auntie Betty had in her house. She would always give you a cup of tea in a little blue and white china teacup. And here's the spoon. So this really is adding in just a few found objects, and this is a photo of Auntie Betty when she was a young girl. So I've created a pocket out of one of her handkerchiefs here that you might remember from the 1950s. And again, I've used the background, an old tray cloth that I've put on. Again, this came off the dressing table, and I've just layered those up really. And a little sugar bowl. Now I've deliberately added a little bit of a tea stain here just to give that vintage look, but you can see how you can create your pages using very little really, but there's a lot of detail in there. I'm just going to home in on this one here. This one again is on the same sort of idea, but using knitting, crochet, and I've just, if I pull that across here, look, I've threaded a crochet hook through the lace. Again, that was just different ideas on how to save those into a project. And you can see here the little snippets of cloth tucked away into, again, another pocket. So you can sort of add all kinds of lovely treasures. This is the back cover for that journal, and all I've done is machine sewn some vintage patterns onto this 1960s fabric. Okay. So keep it very, very simple. Now this is going to be a cloth journal. This is the start of a project, and actually you might see through my videos how this grows. But this is basically one of my designs. So and all I've done is I've embroidered straight onto my panel, and then I've hand sewn that onto a piece of British felt. And this is now going to be the cover. Okay, so this is another way of working, creating your cloth journal, but working sort of the title page. The outer cover has already been created, and then I'm going to add my pages into the middle here. Okay, so this is another way of starting that project. Okay, so watch that space because you might see that in a few videos. And then the final one that I just want to showcase with you today is this one here. So this is created from linen, same technique. So I have cut out pages of the linen to work on, and I've actually used my embellisher machine. So it's like a needle felting machine, but I've combined that with hand sewing and other techniques and really created these layers. So this is my title page, and I'm just going to flick through. So this was me needle felting, excuse me, and just putting a few samples in here. So it's a very different feel, but again it's adding all those different textures, and you can see along here how I have literally just sewn the pages together with a running stitch, okay, and left the pages to fray. So I worked on a vintage scarf on this detail. Again, I've felted in some yarn to create an extra texture, and I've added in some buttons on here. Here I've needle felted some hearts and then just added a couple of vintage pearls at the end. Here I experimented using cloth with my needle felting machine, my embellisher, and then I've hand sewn some buttons on with some little extras embroidery. And this last sort of page I wanted to create a design using various techniques. So you can see I've added some embroidery using my needle felter, and then some little crocheted flowers that I created. Okay, so again you can use these as sampler journals. They don't have to have a purpose. You can make them almost quite organic. The edges don't need to be neat. I kind of like that rugged look, but again the choice is yours. So we will be covering that. This is just really an introduction, and this is the start of a piece of textile art that I've popped on the back. Again, it was using my machine, but then after I took it off the machine, I actually hand felted in some of the detail. And this is just pieces of silk that I sort of shredded and added in. And this is just a moonlight design where I've hand sewn over, creating this design here, and then just some simple machine sewing up here. Okay, so this is a piece of silk organza that I've added onto the top, so that forms the back. And really this piece is not finished, a lot of it's still not finished. These are just some examples. So you can see a cloth journal really doesn't have any rules. You can create all kinds of beautiful treasures, really, with what you've got in your stash. You don't need a lot in that equation, and you can just build up the layers. Okay, you can make it as simple or as complicated as you really want it to be. Okay, so I hope that's inspired you to have a go, and if you're interested, you'll be able to follow along with some more projects coming soon. Thank you for joining me. Bye for now.